customized energy solutions.
Hi, my name is Ann Yu. Is that too loud, or is that okay? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ann Yu. I am Vice President of North American Consulting within CES, Customized Energy Solution. Customized Energy Solutions is a services and consulting company. I will not go into all the details in terms of the business that we do, but I do want to highlight a couple of different things. We are, in our wholesale services, as you see here, we schedule around 30 gigawatt of resources around the country, and about more than 85% of them are renewable. So we schedule a lot of solar and wind, over 1,000 megawatt of energy storage. With my tenure here at CES, I have helped many different developers looking into how to build energy storage or what kind of services energy storage can provide in different wholesale services, in different wholesale markets around the country. Within CES, we have a lot of experience understanding what renewable does, how to dispatch them, how they fit to the greater scheme of things. So with today's presentation, I understand that different people probably would have different opinions in terms of how we present the information, but I do hope that we can address as many questions as possible. So today we're gonna start with specifically on mission statement in terms of why we're here today, and then really have a summary slide in terms of talking about the choices that we're facing, or City of Naperville is facing today. I do have a lot more details on each of the options. Given the time today, I'm not gonna go into every single slide, but I do wanna highlight a couple of ones that I think people will typically have questions on, and then I'm happy to take questions. I don't know if we wanna take questions as we go alone or afterwards. Either way works for me. Okay, all right. So
after, I'd rather have you go through your presentation,
sure,
and then we'll bring up the questions.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. All right, so I do want to make sure that we're all on the same page here in terms of what we're doing today. So the mission statement that we have is that City of Naperville wants to supply the residents and business of Naperville with consistent and cost-effective power sources to meet the community's power needs while exploring more sustainable energy options. And this include advancing toward state's CEJA goal. The reason why we're discussing this particular issue right now, as you heard last week, IMEA is requesting a decision by April 30th in terms of whether to renew the contract, and then sort of that's why we're kind of going through this process of discussing and really looking through all the details, understanding what's going on, what are the different options. So as Louis pointed out today, we're not making a recommendation yet. We do want to present the facts. We're presenting the details here, so hopefully we get feedback today, and then we can better come up with the decision in terms of a recommendation. The other key point in terms of why we're making this decision now, when the contract is only coming up in 2035, is that anything else that we're considering today do require time to set up, to prepare for whatever that's happening if Naperville decides to leave IMEA. We do need time to really look into the different options, how to model, to staff up, to really look at how to enter PJM as a market. So that's why we're talking about this today. So this is really kind of a summary of talking about all the different options that we have available. So on the left-hand side, you see that if Naperville stay outside of a joint action agency, what happens? And then on the right-hand side, it's more part of a joint action agency. So really the high-level takeaway from this is that if Naperville stays outside of a joint action agency, you are looking at more autonomy. You can decide as a community what kind of energy sources that you want to have. But the flip side of that would be there would be more risks. So I wanted to go into this in a bit more detail in the later slides, but here really what we're looking at is really three different options we're thinking about. So the first one is purchasing from the PJM wholesale market. Second one, contracting through a power purchase agreement, a PPA. And then the third one, owning generation that Naperville runs itself. So one thing I want to stress is that this is not mutually exclusive. So as an example that you can see here, portfolio ABC in that middle graph, Portfolio A has 40% owned generation, 40% contracted through PPA, and then 20% purchased from market. Portfolio B has 40%, the middle column has 40% PPA, 60% market purchase with PJM, whereas Portfolio C has 60% owned generation, 30% PPA, and then 10% market purchase. These are all valid options. So the point is that you're trying to serve the load depending on what options that you have. And this is both locally, geographically, and then also understanding, what's within the possible sort of financial situation that Naperville has. So again, on the left-hand side, when you stay outside of a joint action agency, what you're facing is that you have more autonomy deciding how you want to procure your power, but at the same time, there are different types of risks associated with them. And again, I'll go into that in details later. On the right-hand side, when you're part of a joint action agency, whether it's staying with IMEA or joining a different joint action agency, what you're essentially doing is that you're sharing this responsibility with someone else. So as long as you're sharing this responsibility with someone else, you have lost autonomy. You do have to get others' approval on, okay, do we want to procure this power plant or not? But at the same time, because you're sharing that responsibility, you're also sharing the risk. So on the right-hand side, when you're part of a joint action agency, it's really less autonomy and less risk. And then we're going to go into the detailed discussion in terms of what's the option here. In the lower right-hand section, we do kind of talk about the selling utility to ComEd. And I think one of the comments was saying that, correct, we didn't really dive deep into what that would look like if Naperville decided to sell the utility to ComEd. But I think one thing worth pointing out is that if the community is really focusing on autonomy or having that option or knowing where your power is coming from, selling the utility to ComEd is not going to make that better. So in our opinion, selling the utility ComEd is really more focusing on you don't really get a say, you have no autonomy at all, and maybe there will be more risk depending on how ComEd is looking at Naperville as a load. So before we go into each of the options, I do want to spend some time on the prior knowledge. I understand that there could be some misunderstanding in terms of energy and capacity, so I'm going to try my best here and see if I can explain that better. So on the left-hand side corner, you do see this is a load profile. So essentially what happens is that, and then the numbers at the bottom on the x-axis is hours of the day. So this is your typical usage. You wake up in the morning, 6 or 7, the electricity loads start climbing up, and then throughout the day you go to work, kids go to school, so it just keeps going up and up. When it is the highest, it's around 5, 6 p.m. This is usually the same for across the nation. You see that peak at around 6 p.m. or so is when everybody comes home. You turn on your TV, you started cooking and all that. So that's when you have the peak load. And then after that, as people go to bed and the load would just continue to drop. So the concept of energy and capacity is a completely different thing. So when you think about energy, it's really that area under this curve. So you can see all that blue part that's shaded. It's really, you're looking at the energy or per megawatt hour, per kilowatt hour to supply that area under the curve. When you're thinking about capacity, it's actually, do you have enough capacity to serve that peak load, which is 6 or 7 p.m. in this particular graph. So for any procurement purposes, you have to have both energy and capacity because you need to fulfill that area under the curve. But at the same time, you can't control people in terms of when they turn on the lights. When all of them turn on the lights at the same time, you turn on your TV, you are expecting that they turn on. So you do have to have enough resources from a system perspective to serve that peak load. And that's really the difference between energy and capacity here. So if you look at the right-hand side in terms of the lower graph, when you have different types of generation, their ability to serve energy and capacity are different. When you have something like a gas power plant that typically we call dispatchable, but really it just means that it's there when you need it. So again, we look at the curve, we say, okay, we're using 100 megawatt at 7 a.m., 110 megawatt at 8 a.m. What a gas plant can do, because it's dispatchable, you are ramping that gas plant up as the load increases, and then you can ramp it down as the load decreases. So that's why a gas power plant not only supplies energy, but because of its dispatchability, it can actually supply a good amount of capacity as well. And capacity is when you need it, right? So that, again, that 6, 7 p.m. peak when you see there is when you need it, the gas is there. So let's look at a solar power plant. So a solar power plant would, as you know, would only generate when there is solar available. So what would happen in the same case? So solar power plant would generate energy, again, the area under the curve to fulfill that. But when you need it during that peak hour, 6 or 7 p.m., solar is not there. You're not going to get any solar during that time. And this is why I want to circle back to anyone who was here with IMEA's presentation last week, is that I believe it is 100 megawatt B hollow only having 6 megawatt accredited capacity. That's the reason why when the system needs it the most, solar is not available. So you can only accredit it, or you can only count this many megawatt from a solar perspective. That's all it needs. So again, so if you look at this lower right-hand bar chart here, I'm comparing different portfolio. So on the left-hand side, we're saying that, let's say the gray bar is a big chunk of gas. What you can do to count the actual capacity of that gas is a lot, because like I said, capacity is dispatchable for gas. So gas is there when you need it, even during that peak hour. Whereas on the right-hand side, those two bars with a lot of green, you have, let's say that's a solar in the middle, but then solar is not available when you need it during that peak time. So you can only count it for a smaller amount of capacity that's available. So those are two big concepts that I want to make sure that people understand here, because when we're talking about energy, we're not necessarily thinking about capacity, and I hope this will, help explain that. So kind of going to combine the previous two slides together. What we're thinking here is that in the same portfolio, we can have purchase from PJM market, we can have PPA from different types of resources, we can have city-owned generation, again, from different types of technology. But depending on the technology, how they're counting toward that capacity obligation is going to be different. So this graph on the right, the graph on the left is focusing on how do you count capacity, whereas the graph on the right is focusing on how do you count for energy. So while you might have two different sets of portfolio that meets the same energy needs, they might not meet the same capacity needs. So as a utility, as a load-serving entity, you have to procure for both. Okay. All right, so let me go back to this one. So now I'm going to go into a bit more detail on each of these options here. I will have to skip some slides given the time that we have, but I'm happy to address any questions afterwards on specific slides. So I'm going to go into the market purchase with PJM, contracting for PPA, owning resources, and then on the Joint Action Agency side, I'll talk about staying with IMEA and then join a different Joint Action Agency as well. So market purchases from PJM. So this is PJM, if I can use a simple term to explain it, is really a wholesale stock market. What PJM does is it takes what people need on the demand side, and then it takes whatever that's available to supply to the wholesale market, and then just match them. Try to figure out what is the market price that actually meets the supply and demand. So to be part of the PJM market, you do have to kind of register with PJM. So right now, IMEA is the one who's kind of performing this function for Naperville. Overall, there are various different obligations that you have to do. Again, in the the remaining of the slides, we do have details in terms of what's the market scheduling function, what's long-term planning, what's regulator compliance, what do we do on energy efficiency program. But essentially, to be able to transact with PJM, you do have to go through these processes, and it's also a specific functions that Naperville currently doesn't have, that you would have to really staff up and then focusing on how do we come up with a function that will help Naperville to purchase energy from the market. So the benefits of being able to purchase energy from wholesale market is that it's flexible, because you bid in your load and you say, tomorrow at 10 a.m. I need 100 megawatt, at 11 a.m. I need 150. And then PJM will look at its supply stack and try to meet your load. So you can be flexible in a way that, I could do this for tomorrow, I could do this for next month. So there's a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can do when you're purchasing energy from the wholesale market. The flip side to that is that you have to accept whatever the pricing is from that wholesale market at that given time. So this is where wholesale electricity market is different from stock market, is that if you have a stock price in mind, you say I want to buy Tesla at $100, you can wait until that happens. But you cannot do that for wholesale energy market. You have to do it right at the time when the load needs it. So that's really the fundamental difference, is that you have to accept whatever the market pricing is at that given time, and therefore you're exposed to this market risk. The market risk being that you don't really know what's going to happen to the energy price. You don't know what happens to the capacity price. Like we talked about earlier, we do have to purchase capacity as a load-serving entity. And then there's also a separate set of services called ancillary services that PJM provides, really kind of modulating your frequency, making sure that if a power plant goes out, someone else will come and pick it up. So because of all these market functions, we are participating as a market participant in PJM, buying energy from there. You are exposed to these different type of fluctuations. Okay. So I'm gonna skip a bunch of slides here. So this one, we are really trying to express what happens when you are exposed to that PJM market wholesale pricing fluctuations, as we discussed. So on the left, the pink bar here is what current ComEd's residential rates are. This is based on a typical Naperville household energy usage of 844 kilowatt hour. The middle blue section is currently Naperville's rate. And then on the green section here is what happens if Naperville really tried to buy everything from a PJM wholesale market. And this is a lot of caveat around this. This is a 2-year forward pricing that you could probably look at kind of locking in this price for 2 years. And then we're kind of using the same customer charge and stuff like that, consistent with what Naperville is charging, and then some other adjustment consistent with what ComEd has. But essentially, if you look at the bottom line here, the green section here says $127 versus right now Naperville residential average bill is about $120, so slightly higher than that and more comparable with what ComEd is paying on the residential side. So what happens when you are exposed to the PJM wholesale market, when the energy prices changes, when the capacity prices changes? How far is the pricing going to deviate, or how far is the bill going to deviate from what we're seeing today? So here's an example of what happened, and I believe last week, IMEA already discussed in terms of capacity pricing fluctuation. So as a reminder, PJM earlier was clearing capacity at, let's say around $30 per megawatt day. Beginning, last year, this year, the capacity pricing is now at 300. So it's a 10-time increase. So depending on which region you're looking at, but that's kind of the scale we're looking at. So $30 per megawatt day versus $300 per megawatt day. So here is a example showing, how that fluctuation in capacity price is going to impact the residential bill in Naperville. So you can see that there's a range from, lower than what it is today, negative 10%, to higher than what, 13% above what happens today. And then here's another view of what happens if the energy price change. So again, I'm using like a bracket around 1 point times today's energy rate versus half of today's energy rate. And I'm showing you a range of it could go from negative 11% to all the way above 22% above today's residential bill. So these are concepts or ideas in terms of how capacity price changes and then energy price changes as you purchase from the PJM market is going to impact residential bills. Okay. All right, so next I'm going to talk about the contracting with PPA piece. So I think there are definitely a lot of discussion that has happened here in terms of looking into signing PPAs with solar, wind, different type of resources. But essentially, PPA itself is really just a bilateral contract. So you can sign it with any type of technology. It doesn't have to be solar and wind. It can be a gas or it can be anything else that's available. What happens, why would you sign a PPA is because you get a pre-negotiated price, really understanding, where my energy price is going to be for the next 20, 25, 30 years, depending on the type of technology. So typically today in the PPA market, you do sign about 20-year contract with solar and wind. And these are long-term contracts. This is the same for whether IBEA signs it or Naperville goes out to signs it. Different utility would opt to sign a 20-year PPA contract, and that will help them firm or secure kind of a specific pricing that they know, this is predictability that's really helping them understanding, what my cost projection will look like in the next 20 years. So that's the benefit of PPA. So what is the flip side of that? So when you sign a PPA, you are essentially asking a developer to develop a plan for you. And then that could be like a couple of years down the road. There are so many different potential risks that could happen between signing PPA versus when the project really comes online. There could be supply chain issues, there could be interconnection issues delaying the projects. And there could be other issues even if after the project comes online, if the project is not generating energy as you hope it would be, the capacity factor for solar or wind being lower than average. So those would impact how you're planning for your energy. So what's going to happen, mostly what happens in that situation is that, for example, you're planning for a solar PPA to come online by, let's say, 2028. For whatever reason, the developer has to delay, and then it comes online like 2 years later. So for that 2 years, Naperville's on the hook to find that energy for yourself. So most likely, you're probably buying that from the PJM wholesale market. So I have an illustration here. Okay, so this is kind of a concept in terms of how PPA works, but we're going back to that same graph of what the system load looks like. So this is Naperville system load. Again, we have that, 6 and 7 a.m. in the morning, the load start climbing up, and then it will kind of peak around 5 or 6 p.m. And this is what solar and wind generation look like. Again, every day will look different as solar or wind is available. Depending on their intermittency, this is what the generation profile look like. And you can see clearly that whatever solar is generating, whatever wind is generating, it is not going to match the load that Naperville has. So what do we do? So with that differences, even if you have lots of PPA on solar and wind to try to fulfill your load or your energy needs, you're still going to be left with some differences between what the solar and wind is generating versus what the load needs, and therefore you still need that market function to be able to purchase some energy from PJM to stop that gap between your load and PPA generation. Again, want to make sure that people are clear with this idea is that you cannot just say, I wanted to do everything on PPA because the renewable generation is not going to directly fulfill load every single day. Here, I wanted to address the pricing issue. So you can see the lower right-hand corner here. There are different PPA pricing here over the last 2 years or so. The top line, that's the yellow line, which is the PJM market pricing. So you can see that PJM market pricing is actually higher than most of the other ISOs that we are aware of. This is two different factors. So one is on the demand side. So PJM does have a lot of data centers coming in, and data centers want to have clean energy, or they used to, not recently, and that demand, or like a high demand, is really driving that price going up high. And then the second piece to it is really on the supply side. So in the PJM market, if you want to be able to sell as a renewable energy project, you actually have to interconnect with the grid. So interconnection with the grid just means that I am telling PJM, hey, I want to sell energy to you. You have to make sure the transmission line comes to me, take the power from me, and then I can actually feed that to you. But the interconnection process in PJM is very backlogged. There are so many projects waiting in the interconnection queue. So it takes many, many years for the project to be able to come online. And because of this demand, high demand and not enough supply, that's why you're seeing PJM's pricing being at this around $80 per megawatt hour, and this is only P25. So the kind of the third option on that not joining a JAA side, we're talking about asset ownership. So asset ownership itself is pretty straightforward. Naperville would own and maybe operate. You could decide to outsource your operation as well, but it's really kind of owning your own asset and trying to figure out how you can use that asset to supply your load. And in the sort of the remaining detail slides, we specifically talk about owning gas, and that's because about 50% of PJM's capacity today is actually gas units. And gas units, as I explained earlier, because of their dispatchability, they do fulfill both the energy and capacity requirement that Naperville has. However, under CEJA's description, gas as it is today is actually not eligible. They have to find a way to either retire, find a clean resource, or do carbon sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration on gas to actually make the gas project comply to CEJA mandates. So owning an asset like gas, there are, again, certain risks around project development. But the other point I wanted to mention here is that there's also fuel risk, specifically on gas units. So we had seen back in 2022, when the war in Ukraine started, the natural gas price jumped about 3 times during a couple of months, and really just kind of reflecting that world, supply-demand issue. So when you own an asset like a gas unit, you are kind of exposed to that fuel risk, and that will be reflected in the residential bill that Naperville residents see. Okay. So moving to the right side of that summary slide, kind of talking about joining or staying with a joint action agency. And I understand that IMEA came here last week already, kind of talk about all these different plans. So I just wanted to hone in on a couple of things. So here we're back to that concept of what's nameplate and what can you really count toward that critical hours. I replotted what IMEA had here, really going from 2015 to 2050. So the 2 columns are a set together. So the ones that are far left, those 2 columns are both 2015. On the left is nameplate. On the right to it is accredited, which means, again, how many megawatt of capacity can you rely on during that peak hour? And then as we go, forward, we'll see how these change. So you see that by, 2045 or 2050, the column on the left really increased a lot on nameplate. You see a lot of solar, you see a lot of wind, you see a lot of battery and market purchase coming in. But the column on the right in terms of accredited is really minimal. And how is that minimal? Going from the solid green bar to the tiny green bar, and then the solid yellow bar to the tiny yellow bar. Again, that's because solar and wind might not be there when there's a critical hour in the system. And that's really how everybody looks at capacity. It's like, are you going to be there when the system needs you the most? And again, that's why from IMEA's perspective, they have to procure a lot more solar and wind to really meet this capacity needs, because solar and wind account for so little during those critical hours. And then on this particular slide, we are trying to project what happens with IMEA's costs going from where it is today to 2050. Disclaimer here, we're using all public information based on what IMEA has published on the supply stack, and also what their financial requirement is. And you can see that, well, this is actually 2024 number, but I'm kind of plotting it around 2025. You can see that this financial revenue requirement that IMEA has goes from where it is today to $243 million all the way to $690 million, or 2.8 times. Sorry, there's a typo on the first line. It's actually 2.8 times instead of 2.6. So what it says is really that if IMEA is trying to reach its goal of going from 78% of energy provided by coal today to an entire clean stack in terms of just solar and wind and market purchases, you're going to see their revenue requirement increase by 2.8%. And another disclaimer is that this didn't include like the debt services that they had and things like that. This is really focusing on looking at their financial results and then trying to replace what's energy purchase and then the PPAs and stuff, the energy costs that they have with the supply stack that they are planning for 2050. And then we are going to compare that to this red oval dots up here in terms of what are you going to see from a PJM market perspective. So again, this is a little bit tricky, but the idea here is thinking that if you purchase all of your energy needs from PJM market, what would be that number in 2050 versus what it is today? Many caveats here. PJM market itself doesn't include like all the other attributes. So we're only talking about energy here. But like I said, there's capacity and there's renewable energy credits. So if you look at PJM market, and even today and even in 2050, we're looking at maybe about 45% of the capacity is coming from renewable, but the rest is still nuclear. I'm sure coal is probably retired, but nuclear, a lot of gas would kind of constitute the rest of that capacity. So what we did here was kind of a hodgepodge of different data points that we have in terms of if you actually want to purchase as many renewable energy credits for 2050 to actually meet that 100% clean energy goal, plus energy purchases from PJM, plus capacity purchases from the PJM capacity market, what would that price projection be? And it's about 2.9 to 3.1%. Again, this is very high level type of number that we analyzed, and we can get into a lot more detail if we get better numbers coming from different parties. Okay. Do I still have everyone? Okay. All right. So I do want to address a question that was raised earlier, and also we kind of discussed internally as well, is how aggressive or how feasible or how fast or slow is IMEA's plan. Typically, well, actually, I shouldn't say typically. Some public power entities actually does something called IRP, Integrated Resource Planning. So this is when they will look at the resources that they own, they will look at the PPA that they have, and then they'll look at the market condition kind of going forward. And then they will run this internal modeling to try to figure out if I want to meet my load in 2045, 2050, what kind of resources do I need? So I'm just giving two examples here, one from Public Utility District, Franklin Public Utility District in Washington State, another from a town called Stoll in Vermont. So what I'm trying to show here is that this is what everybody is facing. Again, not just the public power entity, but everybody is facing the same issue, that they are trying to retire fossil resources. But as they're trying to retire fossil resources, they have to think about this problem in terms of where's my energy going to come from, where's my capacity going to come from. So on the left-hand side, you see that gap between the line, either the red line or the black line, and that purple block of resources that they currently have. That's what they have to think about. And then the timeline, and apologize that the numbers are so small, but the timeline that they're looking at on the right-hand side, it's about 2045. So they are looking at all these gaps in capacity that they have to fill by 2045. And then on the right-hand side here, for Vermont, for the city, they have the same issue. Their energy, they're retiring some gas. They would have that gap between that top black line and then all this stack that they have down below. Again, the timeline here is about 2043 to the right-hand corner of that graph. So everybody is facing the same issue as we're retiring fossil. How do we actually find resources that would meet this gap and at the same time manage costs in a way that's palatable for residents? All right, and we do have a lot more kind of detail in there. I just wanted to kind of briefly mention this. So we talked about earlier from the summary set in terms of, if you want to stay with a joint action agency, whether it's with IMEA or someone else, you are giving up some autonomy. You're not, you're not the only one who's deciding type of resources that you want to procure, but at the same time, you're spreading out the risk. So we did look into potentially for Naperville to join a different joint action agency. The two specific ones we looked at is NIMPA, Northern Illinois Municipal Power Agency, and then American Municipal Power. So NIMPA is a little bit different. It only has 3 cities as its member, and it's sort of like a special entity or special vehicle that these 3 cities kind of use to procure specifically from Prairie State the power. And then for the rest of the demand that the city have, they kind of have to figure out on their own, like what other type of resources that they want to do. Again, they can go to PPA or they can try to purchase market, but NIMPA doesn't have an obligation to fulfill the entire load for their members. So if Naperville were to join NIMPA, kind of facing the same issue, what do you want to use NIMPA for as a vehicle? Do you want to use it to sign PPA with someone else? That could be a possibility, but you still have to, as a Naperville, from the Naperville's perspective, you still have to decide how you want to do it. So it's not really the type of joint action agency that you're thinking about in terms of they would take care of all these different functions that you think that, for example, IMEA is doing for Naperville today. So that's a special case for NIMPA. A different thing is that you can think about joining, AMP. AMP is a much larger JAA. They do have a lot more, a more diversified portfolio. As you can see here, they are still owners of Prairie State as well. They have this Freeman Energy Center is a gas unit. They get about 35% purchase power, which again here means that you're purchasing from PJM market. That is going to be exposed to whatever the market pricing is. And then they have 4% wind and solar, and then some member coal as well. So there are some different potential choices out there in terms of joining a different joint action agency. But again, the choice is that you might not get as much autonomy as a community to determine what kind of resources that you want. But then at the flip side, you are exposed to less risk. So coming back to the same slide that we discussed earlier, this is kind of summarizing all the different options that we discussed. On the left-hand side, when you're staying outside of a joint action agency, 3 different choices that you can think about: market purchase, PPA, owned generation. And you can decide on different percentage of how you look at this. But I think a key point to notice here is that Naperville does have to step up for each of these options. So if you want to participate into BJM, if you want to sign PPA, if you want to own your own generation, Naperville needs to step up and really pick up these functions, as a utility. Or On the right-hand side, when you're part of a joint action agency, as again we discussed, staying with IMEA, join a different joint action agency. I think the last one in terms of starting a new JAA is a possibility, but at the same time, you still have to make that staffing up that we talked about, because as a joint action agency, you're kind of pulling other load in, and then you would have to then decide, okay, do I want to do market purchase? Do I want to PPA? Do I want to own any generation? The staffing requirement is going to be similar to when you're staying outside of a joint action agency, if Naperville decides to start one. It's just that now you have a larger load pool that you can potentially have a better bargaining power, or figuring out like different options for the members here. So I'm gonna stop here. Hopefully people did understand what I explained, but I'm happy to take any questions.